finally in the process of doing some final tests on my new thrust stand hardware, and I finally have something that I can get a much better look at the really quick acceleration and deceleration of the small brushless motors. So I thought, let's just do a simple test and just kind of get an overview picture of what it looks like, how quickly the motor can react, what sort of amp draw that we're seeing when we're asking it to do very fast throttle changes. So you can see here the test program that we're running, pretty straightforward, just doing 10% step ups on the first ramp, and then down 25% steps on the second, a 50% step throttle steps on the third, and then the last group of tests here, we're going from idle to 75% and from 25% throttle to 100% throttle. So we've got a good range of small steps and larger steps, and we can see if doing large throttle changes from idle is significantly different than doing large throttle changes when we're up already at some speed. For this test, I happen to be using a RCX 1407 motor with a Rotorex tri-blade and a BL Heli-S ESC. And right off the bat, I thought it was super interesting looking at the amp draw of the test. In this, we're looking at two results. I ran the test once with the motor with the prop on and once with the motor unloaded. And you can see the amp spikes at every major throttle change like we expect. But what I didn't expect is the unloaded amp draws are actually not, I figured that they would be less, that the motor under load is going to have a higher draw. And proportionally they do a little bit, like you can see here on the 10% steps. The unloaded actually has a larger spike over kind of the surrounding area, and the loaded motor has a slightly smaller spike, but only slightly. They're actually fairly close in size, all things considered. And you can see the same thing here on the 25%. You know, we have kind of a largish step up, and it stays pretty consistent throughout the entire, starting from idle, the size of this peak versus, you know, from 50%, 75%, and then this last step I think was 5% short. It was only a 20% step to full throttle, so that's slightly smaller. And you can see the same thing here on the largest pulse, largest spike that we get, going from 25% to full throttle. We're seeing basically a 16 amp spike on the motor with no prop on it, and about 21 and a half, 22 amps with the prop. So it's not 16 amps, you know, it's not an absolute number above the local kind of amp draw. So we're, you know, the amp draw that we're seeing at full throttle here at the end of the test is around 11 amps, and so we've got, you know, about an 11 amp spike over our sustained draw versus a 16 amp spike on the motor that doesn't have a prop. But, you know, we're getting about 30% the size of the spike once the motor is loaded down, and it's not nearly as relative to the draw as I would have guessed. So it isn't going to matter nearly as much how heavy prop that you have. The throttle change amp draw seems to be related a lot more closely to just the fact that you're changing RPM full stop, and not how much load the motor happens to be under at the time. This one test in particular, we'll look at it closer in just a bit. The amp draw for the unloaded and the loaded, the peak amp draw is actually almost exactly the same. And if we go in for a closer look, we see a really kind of interesting effect. You can see obviously how the unloaded, the amp draw for the on the unloaded motor spikes up quite a bit faster than the loaded motor. You know, obviously as the RPM is increasing faster, and so it's kind of getting through that, and then it begins to decrease sooner because it, you know, is getting closer to its target RPM. The loaded motor takes longer to get there. But there's this strange section here in the beginning where it doesn't seem to be accelerating as quickly as it does in the middle. This amp draw stays lower than it looks like it wants to be. The kind of the slope of the curve as the amp draw raises here is a lot steeper. You know, you'd expect that to happen over a much shorter period of time. So it definitely looks like, coming from low throttle, we've got some slowdown that we don't see if we go to the next step up, which is going from 25% to 100%. So if we look at this one at the same scale, you'll notice that we don't have this flat spot here at the beginning of the motion. Both the amp draws for the loaded and unloaded test have the same slope, and we have this similar effect that we expect. The loaded prop takes a lot longer to get to RPM, and so the amp draw, while it's accelerating, happens for a longer period of time. If we look at the loaded test, and this time we're looking at the RPM of the motor and the amp draw of the motor, and let's take a closer look at that one odd test point. And I thought this is really indicative of what's going on here. You'll notice the amp draw starts spiking up before the RPM really starts to respond. But there's also the RPM has the same sort of effect that we're seeing in the amp draw here, where there's a much sharper curve here, and if we follow this curve down, it actually seems to slow. There's this section here where it's accelerating slower, and right about where that happens, you'll notice that's the same region that we're seeing this fluctuation in the amp draw. And it happens to be a more jittery sample as well. As soon as it gets past that region, the readings of the amp draw smooth out significantly. This is a very kind of a big time penalty if we look at the amount of time that this is happening, and if we kind of assume, so right now on this range we're looking at about 50 milliseconds between these two spots. So we have like almost 40 milliseconds of time here that it's spending in this slower acceleration zone, compared to if we follow that curve down, that's only about a 10 millisecond gap that we would kind of anticipate. So I wonder if this is maybe low RPM protection kicking in or something like that, because again, this only occurs if we go and look at the 25 to 100. We do not see that effect here. The amp draw spikes up at the same kind of rate through the whole beginning here, and the RPM, while it does take it a couple of milliseconds before it starts to respond, basically we have a consistent curve throughout here, and there isn't that two-step thing. So I've definitely, this is something I'll have to explore more and see if there are some board settings, and you can see this even if we go to the smaller test. Like if we do the idle to 25%, we'll see the same effect, where here we have a really short range where you can kind of see the arc of this curve comes down, and then we've got a bit of a flat spot here, and right over this period of the flat spot, zoom in one more time, right over the period of this flat spot here, we have this really kind of this strange looking amp draw where it's different past when we hit the flat spot, and then we get a smoother curve when it's decelerating down. On this one we're looking at a 10% RPM jump, kind of in the middle-ish of the range. You can see that we're at a motor command of about 1200 out of 2000, so slightly over 50% throttle, and you can see how the amp draw spikes up, how we're basically at a steady state here. We're holding throttle from the previous one, and the amp draw spikes the same time that the RPM starts to move, and it hits its peak really early on and then starts to trail off. And you'll notice if we kind of look at where this is kind of our steady state RPM there, and so here is right about the time when we actually hit our RPM target. The amp draw still is dropping ever so slightly, and this is about let's see, on the scale we've got 50 millisecond major scale, so this is almost 70 milliseconds from the time that the command is issued right here at 5.5 seconds to when we actually reach our target RPM for the first time. There's a little settle that happens after that, but the peak of the amp draw is only about 15 milliseconds after that throttle command initially happens, and it occurs right at the point where we start decelerating towards our target. So we have the most acceleration is happening before we hit peak amp draw, and then past peak amp draw it actually slows down a lot. So we come at the point that we hit our peak amp draw. If we compare where our source, the RPM we're coming from to our peak amp draw, you can see that we're at just about half. So we hit peak amp draw at about half the distance that we have to travel in RPM targets. And here we're looking at the 25% to 100% throttle one, and the same sort of curve. We have a very sharp increase, and then it all tapers off. Our target, so this is roughly 80 milliseconds to go from 25% to full throttle. And if we compare where our peak throttle is there, in this case the amp draw peak happens slightly less than 50% of the distance. So you can kind of see the pattern there, where we're accelerating halfway through our target set, and we're drawing a lot of amps, and as soon as we start closing in our target, the amp draw starts dropping off. But it also means that the second half of the acceleration, once the amp draw stops, you can see the acceleration tapers off quite a lot. We're moving a lot faster towards our target in the first, say 15 milliseconds of our throttle change here, versus the last 75 milliseconds to cover the last half of that throttle change. And of course, if we go in and look at that idle to 75%, we can see that this period of lower acceleration actually has a pretty big effect as well coming off idle. So if our target RPM is roughly about here, so call this about 130 milliseconds to hit our target, versus about 80 for the one, and most of that is due to this very slow start that we have. And we can see that on the other sections of the test as well. If we go to the 25% step up, we're looking at, again, just shy of 150 milliseconds. And the next step up, this is down to just about 100 milliseconds for the exact same RPM, or not RPM, but throttle position change. And the only difference here is we're not coming off almost idle, and we don't have that slow section at the very bottom. And finally, in this chart, we're looking at the RPM of both tests compared. So this is the unloaded in green and the loaded motor in red. You can see how much of a load that the Rotor X prop puts on this motor versus what it'll do completely unloaded. But what we really want to look at here is how much faster is the unloaded motor versus the loaded motor. Like, how big of an effect is, say having a heavier prop. This is going to be the most extreme possible example we can have of a heavier prop versus a lighter prop. And it certainly does make a difference. For instance, here, the smallest 10% step up from idle to 10%, say we hit our target RPM, loaded down right here, 150 milliseconds, and then unloaded, say our target RPM is right about there, and we're doing that in only about 80 milliseconds. So this is at about a half throttle step, and we can see we hit at about 80 milliseconds, and unloaded, we hit our target at about 50 milliseconds, 50 or 60, pretty close. Braking performance, if we look at the same range, is about half throttle. Right here, about 110 milliseconds, so slower than it accelerates. And then unloaded, that's about 60 or 70 milliseconds. So that's a lot closer to the deceleration or the acceleration profile that we had from the same thing. The loading the motor down definitely does not seem to want to brake quite as easily as it accelerates. And then if we have a look at 50% to full throttle, again just about 100 milliseconds, and look at 25% to full throttle, and just slightly over 100 milliseconds, maybe like 105 milliseconds or something like that, before we actually settle in and hit our target RPM for the first time. Now, obviously, we cover a lot more ground a lot sooner than that. We hit 50% of our target RPM after only about 15 milliseconds. So it takes 10 times longer to cover the second half of the journey than it does in the first half. So that's another thing that I'm really curious about trying, doing some feed forward, where say if you're going from 25% to 50% throttle, if we give it a burst of 100% throttle for 2 or 3 milliseconds at the beginning of that, do we get better performance? Can it stop an acceleration and hit a target RPM without overshooting, and what sort of effect does that have on the amp draw as well? That'll be something to look at a later time.